"I'm tired of eating human flesh. You have heard of cold-blooded killers, but these guys would make even the most savage killer look like an amateur. They sliced, crushed, decapitated, and slept with their victims, and when they were finished, they cooked and ate them. Do you think this is cruel and heartless? Wait until you see what these cannibals did in court. In this video, I will show you how cannibals reacted as they were given the life sentence." Mark Lonsky. Lonsky looked nothing like the monster he was portrayed to be as he sat quietly in court, listening to the mother of his victim read her statement. She went all out saying that he hopes Lonsky suffered just like he had made her family suffer, and that he feels pain while spending the remainder of his years alone. Lonsky listened intently, his back slightly hunched forward, and his overgrown beard giving the impression of a homeless man who got stuck in a nightmare. When the judge asked him if there was anything he would like to say before his sentence was imposed, Lonsky replied with a monotonous "no." At this point, the judge read his sentence, life without the possibility of parole. Lonsky didn't flinch, and neither did he show any remorse. He simply stood there and took it all in. Perhaps Lonsky understood quite well that there was nothing he could say or do that would be of any help, or maybe he didn't just care what the court decided to do to him. 25-year-old Kevin Bacon never knew he wouldn't be spending Christmas Eve with his family. Bacon, a student of the University of Michigan Flint, agreed to go on a date with a guy he met online. It seems Bacon was aware of Lonsky's violent fetish, according to police reports. However, the young man probably didn't know that Lonsky had more than just sexual fetishes. Lonsky murdered Bacon that night, stabbing him in the back before slitting his throat. He then hung Bacon upside down from the roof, cut off his genitals, and ate them. The next day, Bacon's family had gathered together for breakfast, and when Bacon failed to show up, he was reported missing. During the investigation, police questioned Bacon's roommate at the university, and he told them that Bacon had gone out on a date with a man he met online. 4 days later, the police knocked on Lonsky's home, and according to his attorney, Lonsky let the police in despite knowing he had a body hanging in his basement. This was meant to be an insanity plea, and though what he did was outrightly insane, Lonsky couldn't fool the judge into believing that he wasn't in the right state of mind when killing Bacon. The trial brought to light several instances when Lonsky had crossed paths with police officers after his victims ran off from the basement crying out for help. A month before Bacon was killed, the police received a call from a guy saying he was trying to get away from some creepy guy who had tied him up in his basement. The police arrived in the nick of time to see the frantic man who was covered in blood, begging Lonsky's neighbor for help, saying, "Help me, keep him away. He wants to hurt me. He wants to hurt me." The neighbor describes Lonsky as a very odd-looking gentleman who wore just a skirt with no shoes and had braided his beard. The police stopped Lonsky, but he was never charged, and neither was the case investigated. Had they dug a little bit deeper, I'm sure they would have uncovered enough evidence to put Lonsky away before he killed someone. And who's to say Bacon was his first victim? For now, Lonsky remains in prison, where he is less likely to satisfy his cravings for human flesh and have to make do with prison chow. Armin Maiwes. Maiwes walked into the court with his attorneys and took a seat. This was the day his fate would be decided for the second time, and from the look on his face, it is easy to see that Maiwes wasn't expecting any leniency from the judges. At first, Maiwes was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison for killing and eating a man he met online. Considering the nature of the crime, 8.5 years in prison was clearly a pat on the back. The prosecutors had expected a tougher sentence, and so they appealed the case. So for a second time, Maiwes found himself sitting across the judges. Although his face showed no emotions, he must have been aware of the fact that he was out of luck. His case, the first cannibal case in Germany, drew the attention of the media, and Maiwes became known as the Master Butcher. Maiwes revealed he had always longed to eat human flesh. "I'd spent over 40 years longing for it, dreaming about it, and now I was getting the feeling that I was actually achieving this perfect interconnection through his flesh." His dream finally came true after Bernd Brandes, a 43-year-old engineer, replied to an ad that Maiwes had posted online, asking for a volunteer to appease his urge for cannibalism. Brandes met Maiwes at his home where the act was recorded. First, Brandes took several sleeping pills with alcohol, perhaps to lessen the pain or knock him out. After that, Maiwes then chopped off Brandes's penis with a knife, cooked it, and gave some to Brandes to eat. Of course, they had tried eating it raw, but Brandes said it was too chewy. This must have been some sort of Last Supper for Brandes, but a much darker and twisted version. After they had both shared the part of Brandes, it was time to bid him farewell. Maiwes read from a Star Trek novel while Brandes slowly bled out in a bathtub. Seeing that it was taking too long for Brandes to die, Maiwes decided to do the honor of speeding up the process, so he stabbed him to death. I'm not sure if he came to this decision out of pity or because he couldn't wait any longer. Brandes' remains lasted for several months, after which Maywes needed a new volunteer. He placed an ad just like he had done before, but this time he wasn't so lucky. The ad was reported to the police, who searched his apartment and found body parts and a recorded video of Maywes slaughtering Brandes after hanging the body on a meat hook. Maywes was immediately arrested, and during his trials, the judges were torn between charging him with murder or manslaughter. At first, he was convicted of manslaughter, being that his victim had consented to the crime. However, the sentence was overturned after the judge came to the conclusion that Maywes acted out of self-seeking motives and has shown that, to this day, he does not regret his actions. Maywes insisted that his only intention was to eat Brandes, not kill him. I fail to see how he could have done one without the other, being that eating Brandes would ultimately result in death. Maybe the mind of a cannibal just works differently. In the end, Maywes was convicted of murder and given a life sentence. Nino Mbatha. Mbatha lowered his head and used a hood to cover his face during his trial. He had come to regret his decisions. And when I say regret, I am not saying that the self-proclaimed traditional healer and cannibal had any remorse for killing and eating a fellow human. I mean, he regrets exposing himself to authorities. The judge believes he might have been driven by the need to unburden himself of the guilt he felt. I wonder just how much human flesh he had eaten before getting to this point. Maybe he was just fed up with the meat but lacked the self-control to stop himself. So he decided the best approach was to walk into the police station with enough evidence such that his claims could not be refuted even by a blind man. And oh, the look on the faces of the police officers as they listened to a man with a sack proclaim he was tired of eating human flesh. Just like the judge said, this is the stuff of nightmares. Mbatha, a traditional healer, had walked into a local police station in South Africa with a bag and a horn. On getting there, the 33-year-old told the police officers he needed their help. After hearing his story, it is said that the officer who had received Mbatha called his colleague to come and listen to what was being said. I am certain none of the officers had witnessed this before, not just because this was a case of cannibalism, but also because the perpetrator turned himself in willingly. So their conclusion that Mbatha was insane is justified. Seeing that he was being doubted, Mbatha had the chance to walk away and go on killing, but he decided to prove his claims by pulling out a human head and leg from the bag he carried. Talk about an Uno reverse. The officers must have gone from "you are insane" to "this is insane" in a matter of seconds. This was clearly an unfamiliar situation to the officers who had listened to Mbatha spill his guts. But unlike the priest, the officers were not obliged to keep his confessions a secret. They had a duty to keep the public safe, and that meant arresting Mbatha. 10 police officers were sent to Mbatha's house, where they discovered more body parts. According to the judge, the house was a disgusting mess. Upon seeing the house, the officers concluded that, contrary to his claims, Mbatha was not a victim and couldn't have been held captive, since there were no locks on the door and the windows had no burglar proof. This was when Mbatha had a change of heart and decided to deny confessing to the officers that he eats human flesh. Clearly, he was having second thoughts. Because of this, the prosecutors could only charge Mbatha with murder. His last victim, 24-year-old Zanele, was sacrificed for good fortune. Mbatha had been approached by a man named Magubane, who wanted to have good fortune, and together they killed Zanele. According to Mbatha, the ancestors insisted that blood must be spilled, so Mbatha concocted a traditional medicine to cure Magubane's misfortunes using Zanele's body parts. The bizarre nature of the case drew a large, crowd of spectators who came to witness the trial and perhaps have a glimpse of the unusual man who had an appetite for human flesh. In the end, Mbatha was condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars, but his story is one the community wouldn't forget for a very long time. Stefan R. Stefan covered his face with cardboard in court, a rare privilege seeing that he had not only murdered his victim, but also dismembered his body and eaten some parts. It is hard to tell if he covered his face out of shame or regret, but letting him cover his face was the extent of the court's leniency. Stefan was convicted of murder with the intent to eat his victim. For that, he was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole due to the special gravity of his crimes. Stefan was a school teacher, a profession that is considered noble, but while hiding in plain sight as a school teacher, he spent most of his time scrolling through cannibal forums as Master Butcher 79, which is believed to be a reference to Armin Maiwes, a German convicted of cannibalism. He even opted to answer questions left by other users. One of the questions Stefan answered was if it was possible to survive a genital amputation. Stefan began his answer with the words, "in my experience." If he was a surgeon or had undergone the process himself, then this statement wouldn't be so suspicious. Or perhaps he was simply referring to the experiences of others who had gone through the process. It is impossible to know what he really really meant when he wrote, "in my experience," seeing that Stefan was really tight-lipped all through his trial, but judging from his nickname, it is quite easy to see a connection with Maywes, who ate his date's genitals. In fact, Stefan met his victim online, just like Maywes and many other cannibals. I believe at this point it is safe to say do not follow creepy people you meet online back home. The evidence found in his browsing history led detectives to the conclusion that Stefan was interested in cannibalism, but it was the sniffer dogs who first sniffed out the teacher's dark secrets. Stefan drugged his date, a 44-year-old man who shared the same name as the killer. He then slit his throat and cut off his genitals, and according to prosecutors, he intended to eat them. After taking parts of his victim, Stefan then cut the corpse into pieces with a saw and buried it in several different locations. It is clear he had a well-thought-out plan of how to discard the body and avoid leaving anything that would tie him to the victim. He also bought chemicals for dissolving human remains. Stefan would have gone away with the murder had it not been for the well-trained dogs. Once the victim's bones were discovered 2 months after he was reported missing, 2 sniffer dogs were put on the trail, and they both led investigators to Stefan's house, where more evidence was uncovered, including blood stains in the freezer, which forensic analysis proved belonged to the victim. His browser history, the blood stains, and the accusing noses of the sniffer dogs all pointed to one fact, that Stefan was a killer. But something else stood out to the investigators, and that was how neatly the flesh had been removed from the victim's bones. It was what led the police to believe that the victim had fallen prey to a cannibal, and despite pleading not guilty, Stefan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Stephen Griffiths. Griffiths liked to be in control, so it was not so surprising that he didn't let any emotions show when the families of his victims called him a coward, or when the judge sentenced him to life in prison for his wicked and monstrous murders. The 40-year-old PhD student of criminology called himself the crossbow cannibal, after the fact that he liked to kill his victims using a crossbow. His fascination for crime began at a very early age. When he was 17, Griffiths was arrested for attacking a supermarket manager unprovoked. He was sent to prison for 3 years and later spent another 2 years in prison for threatening a girl with a knife. While most teens would dream of joining the army, becoming a lawyer, or getting into the medical profession, Griffith knew he was going to become a murderer. An early psychological evaluation showed that he had fantasies of becoming a serial killer, but it is as though Griffith had decided not to be any run-of-the-mill serial killer, so he got himself a degree. First, he majored in psychology at the University of Leeds before going for a PhD in criminology at the University of Bradford. His research focused on crime patterns in the 19th century. This could be where he got the idea for his moniker, the Crossbow Cannibal. Truth is, nobody really knows. However, Griffiths also had a pile of books on serial killers. His obsessive and reserved nature would have made him a great criminologist had he not decided to apply his knowledge differently. To his neighbors, Griffiths was the eccentric lizard man because he kept to himself and owned 2 monitor lizards, which he often took out for a walk on a dog leash. But to the women of the red light district close to where he lived, Griffith was a nice guy. It is said that some of the women came to his house to shower and relax after a long night on the street. His charm and intellect drew in the women, but when they got close enough, they soon realized there was another side to him, an alter ego whom Griffiths called Ven Pariah. Although the police had been warned about Griffiths' tendencies, he still managed to carry out 2 known murders before he was caught on camera killing his 3rd victim. The caretaker of the flats where Griffiths lived was reviewing the CCTV videos when he saw a woman later identified as Suzanne Blemires running out of Griffiths' apartment. The killer followed her shortly. He had a crossbow which he used to shoot the lady in the head before celebrating his victory with a can of drink. Alarmed, the caretaker called the police to report the murder, and Griffiths was arrested. Video footage released by the police shows Griffith telling the police he doesn't know why he killed the girls and that he just doesn't have time for the human race.
So why did you feel the need to kill any of the girls? Fun?
I don't know. Well, I'm misanthropic. I don't have much time for the human race.
Soon after, Griffiths remained silent and didn't say anything more about the victims, denying their families any form of closure. This was his way of remaining in control of the situation. Katherine Knight. Several years ago, Australia witnessed what would be the most cruel crime committed by a woman. Katherine Knight became known as the female Hannibal Lecter. She murdered, cooked, and ate her partner. Katherine showed no mercy to her partner, John Price, and according to the judge, she did not show any remorse for what she had done. Knight had it out for Price, and the judge reached the conclusion that the crime was not only brutal, but also beyond comprehension in civilized society. He also mentioned that all evidence proves that Knight's personality was unlikely to change in the future, and that she was a threat to to others, if ever released from prison. With that, Katherine Knight became the first Australian woman to be given a life sentence, adding that parole should never be considered for her, the prisoner should never be released. The family of the victim applauded the judge's decision. If you think the judge was exaggerating, then get this: despite not showing any violence to other inmates, Knight became the boss lady the moment she stepped into prison. How cold do you have to be that one crime is enough to give you such a powerful reputation in prison? The short answer is extremely cold and brutal. Before killing her husband, Knight seemed to be an ordinary woman with a family. She had previously worked at an abattoir as a boner and slicer. Her relationship wasn't perfect. Sometimes things got violent. But unlike most relationships, Knight was the one who assaulted her partner. Fed up with everything, Price decided to call it quits. So he went to get an apprehended violence order. He was going to leave her. Knight did not like that, and what she did next shocked the world and must have been a nightmare to Price. She stabbed him 37 times while he was asleep. She then decapitated him, and like an expert deboner, she peeled off the skin from the bones and hung it on a meat hook. She then boiled his head, baked slices of his flesh with vegetables, and put some on plates, each having the name of his children. After she finished, she had a taste of her former lover. What was left of him was then arranged with the legs crossed and one hand placed over an empty bottle of soft drink. Whatever she was trying to portray here was lost in the sheer gruesomeness of the crime scene. It is reported that the police officers who found the body had to take 1 year of stress leave. Knight claimed she had memory loss and did not remember what happened in the house, but the judge did not believe her, perhaps due to the fact that this wasn't the first time she had exhibited extreme levels of aggression towards a lover. She once tried to strangle her first lover after he was unable to satisfy her in bed, and when he ran away, Knight decided to get rid of the daughter he had fathered with her by leaving the baby on the railway tracks to be killed. Luckily, the baby was rescued. Knight tried to appeal her sentence, but the judges upheld the previous sentence. They agreed that locking her up for life was the best decision. Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer walked into court like a man on a mission. Although he had pleaded to be insane, Dahmer looked fully aware of what was going on, mostly because of the gravity of the crimes he had committed. His statement in court showed that he had made his peace with whatever punishment he was to receive. According to him, he wanted to be put to death.
This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
He then went on to say how sorry he felt for the families of his victims and how he tried to make amends for the harm he had caused by helping the authorities identify the remains of his victims. This may sound like the words of a man who was deeply sorry for what he had done, but at this point, no amount of apology would suffice, at least not to the more than 17 victims and their families who were gathered in court that day to hear the fate of the man who had killed their brother, father, and uncle. After his speech, Dahmer sat still as he listened to the judge read out all 15 counts of life sentences. He was never getting out of prison, not by a long shot. The prosecutor had successfully proven that Dahmer was cold and calculating and clearly in control of what he was doing. His exact words to the jury were, "He's fooled a lot of people. Please don't let him fool you." There was a lot of evidence to support this argument. First, he carefully selected his victims, lured them to his house where he would murder them, and took pictures of the scene. Sometimes he would engage in necrophilia with his victims, during which time he wore a condom because he was scared of contracting a disease. His first victim was an 18-year-old hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, who had followed Dahmer to his house to have a few drinks. Dahmer was about the same age as Hicks and had just graduated from high school. There is nothing wrong with two teens hanging out alone, especially with Dahmer looking completely harmless. Unknown to Hicks, he was about to become the first of many victims. It all started when Hicks decided it was time to go, but Dahmer was not just ready to let him go just yet, not without fulfilling his sexual fantasies. Rather than persuade him to stay longer, Dahmer must have decided it is easier to just kill Hicks. So he used a dumbbell and hit Hicks on the head twice and then strangled him to death. After fulfilling his sexual fantasies, Dahmer disposed of the body by dissolving the flesh in acid and crushing the bone with a sledgehammer. The murder weapons were thrown into a river. Dahmer was already too good at hiding a dead body for an 18-year-old, and although he took a break as his life took several turns, he eventually started killing again in 1987. This time, there was no stopping him until he was arrested in 1991. Dahmer confessed to not only killing his victims, but also eating their body parts like the heart, liver, biceps, and thighs. Their reasons may be different, but these cannibals all have the same reaction, cold and emotionless. If you like this video, click the card on your screen to see more videos like this.